We are having a dialogue today for the series Responsible Dialogues, Racism in Canada, which is sparked by the recent anti-Black and anti-Asian violence in communities across North America and continued oppression directed at the Indigenous communities. We started this series with Racism in Colonial Canada from Indigenous Perspective. Joining me today is Sherri Kajiwara, Director and Curator of the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby. Sherri, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Fuyubi. It's my honor to be able to come to you from the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Coast Salish, and in particular the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations out here in Burnaby.
Thank you. 今日はどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。So with you today, we want to consider anti-Asian racism in the historical context, especially the historical injustice done to the Japanese Canadian communities in relation to Broken Promises exhibition, which is currently on view at your museum, which derives from a 7-year collaborative research project entitled Landscapes of Injustice. So I'd like to begin by asking you to give an overview of this research project, Landscape of Injustice, and tell us how you have been involved with this project.
Landscapes of Injustice is a 7-year multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, community-engaged research and public history project headed by Dr. Jordan Stanger-Ross of the University of Victoria from 2014 to 2020 that investigated the dispossession of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s. In 1942, just to give you a bit of background, the Canadian government uprooted and interned all people of Japanese descent living in coastal British Columbia. The following year, it authorized the sale of everything they had been forced to leave behind. And as a result, when Canada's internment era finally ended in 1949, Japanese Canadians had nothing to return to. Their homes, farms, businesses, fishing vessels, cars, family pets, personal belongings, everything that they had been unable to take with them were gone. The Landscapes of Injustice Research Collective is united by the conviction that this history still matters. The dispossession of Japanese Canadians is a story about the violation of human and civil rights at a time of perceived insecurity, about measures taken in the name of national defense that made no one safer, about the enduring harms of mass displacement and the loss of home, and it's about the resilience of people confronting injustice. The Nikkei National Museum participated from the very beginning with my predecessor, Beth Carter, partnering on the Shirk grant submission back in 2013. I entered the project when I became the Nikkei National Museum's Director-Curator in 2015 and was originally a co-chair on the Community Records and Directories cluster in Phase 1, the research years, and then co-chair of the Museum Exhibit Cluster in Phase 2 for Knowledge Mobilization. And this is where we produced the Broken Promises exhibit that launched in September 2020. In a pandemic pivot, the exhibit is still up at the Nikkei National Museum, as you can see behind me, and is extended through June 27th. Travel of the exhibit for the next 2 or 3 years with stops in Toronto, Lethbridge, Surrey, Victoria, and Halifax are confirmed after that, thanks to funding from the Government of Canada, Canadian Heritage, in addition to this main traveling exhibit, which takes up about 1,500 to 2,000 square feet of space. A condensed banner-based version suitable for spaces 500 square feet or less is also in circulation. And for both, we have online and digital resources, including an e-catalog, self-guided tour app, and digital education kit.
Wonderful. I had an opportunity to visit the exhibition in person. As a relatively newcomer to Canada, I had a lot to learn about the Japanese Canadian history through this exhibition. So the exhibition, Broken Promises, explored the dispossession of Japanese Canadian in the 1940s. So can you please tell us about the struggle for justice and how the stories are actually told in this exhibition?
Yes, the Broken Promises exhibit illuminates so many losses and not just the dispossession of property. It's about the loss of home, the promises made and broken by the state, and the resilience of the Japanese Canadian community. The biggest challenge that my co-curator, Leah Best, head of knowledge at the Royal British Columbia Museum, and I had was how to unpack 4 years of in-depth academic research in a way that could resonate beyond just scholastic, not just, but beyond scholastic inquiry. There are thousands of individual stories that we wanted to tell, but with the support of our curatorial team, we distilled these down to 7, who are our core storytellers in the exhibit. We introduced them at the beginning and follow them through the internment era, dive deep into the complexity of their losses, and then capture where they ended up, each of them after a decade of dispossession. So the exhibit flow takes you through 5 sections that draws upon all areas of the research, which included community directory records, GIS mapping, land titles and government, legal, and oral history. So the first section, which you see behind me, is where we demonstrate the diverse and thriving Japanese Canadian community in British Columbia before dispossession. To truly grasp what was lost, we wanted visitors to understand what lives lived look like. So here we meet Kaoru Atagi, Eikichi Kagetsu, Teiji Morishita, Keiko Mary Murakami, Hiroshi Okuda, Masue Tagashira, and Tsuma Tonomura. After you pass through this section, next comes the fissure of internment with displays, audio, and maps to show not only the massive forced dispersal of citizens across the country, with some later deported to Japan, but also comparative property maps to show the diversity of density, usage, and land values over time in areas that were dispossessed. Then you reach the Offices of Losses area, which is the heart of the landscapes of injustice research, and it contrasts the clinical and textbook hierarchy of bureaucracy in the state with letters of protest written from the sites of internment and incarceration by individuals from the Japanese Canadian community. In addition to the sample of letters, it is here where we have curated case files of each of our 7 narrators to begin to understand some of the scope of their personal losses. And from there, you continue on to the oral history rotunda with many more than just our storytellers' voices, offering a whole menu of personal stories of loss curated by different emotions and including those of bystanders. This sound theater is surrounded by scrims showing where each of our 7 storytellers ended up. And then before exiting the exhibit, there is a final section that showcases the contemporary artwork of 4th generation Japanese Canadian artist Emma Nishimura, who is also one of our voices in the oral history rotunda. And visitors are invited to respond to the question, can Canada offer a just home for all? So we bookend the exhibit with the 7 narrators, but we weave in several other stories to tell the stories of the injustice and how they dealt with all of that through the display of maps, letters of protest, oral histories, and artwork.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, just recalling one section where Keiko Mary Murakami, I think her maiden name was used for your exhibition, but she's also known as Mira Kitagawa.
Yes, the Order of BC winner,
Yes.
and all of the amazing accomplishments she has made.
Yeah, because of course she advocated for 76 Japanese Canadian students who had been unable to complete their studies here at UBC because of their forced removal in 1942, I think. So
that's correct. And one of the digital apps that I mentioned actually follows her specific story through the entire exhibit. So I do invite all the visitors to download that. It's available for free.
okay. So how do you think, the projects such as Landscape of Injustice and Exhibition Broken Promises will help us understand not only the history, but also the current anti-Asian hate crimes and how we may be able to actually take action against racism?
Racism is fueled by so many things, but I feel it can be distilled down to fear. And I believe that fear can be diminished and transformed through awareness, understanding, and communication. And exhibits have the ability to offer immersive, multisensory, and visceral pathways to understanding anyone or anything we consider separate from ourselves. They give us the opportunity to step into the shoes of another. Learning, listening, and relating to stories from complex histories are all ways that any one of us can take action against racism. Japanese Canadians were only one of many racially marginalized communities in this country in the 1940s, and the first to receive redress from the federal government in the late 80s. I have heard so many times from Japanese Canadian elders, including Mary Kitagawa, that redress was supposed to have been a wake-up call for Canada. It was supposed to have been a wake-up call for Canada to never have such injustices perpetrated ever again on anyone else. And yet we know from current events that racism hasn't gone away. If anything, it's evolved in virulent ways, much like the variants of concern. And the current pandemic has only brought back to the surface anti-Asian racism that has existed in this country since our first arrival. As this country marks 150 years of confederation with as many years rift with racism, hopefully projects like these, exhibits like these, through the work that you do, that I do, that everyone in our collective communities do, hopefully these projects, through them, justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion will help define our next 150 years.
It's very wonderful. It's very important. We are actually trying to do something so that everybody has opportunity to learn, actually, to think about the situation too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, beyond these two projects, is there anything else you might want to share before we finish our dialogue today?
Well, in addition to Broken Promises, there is one other exhibit output that we created. It's online, it's through Digital Museums Canada. It is founded in the letters of protest that the Japanese Canadian community wrote back in the 1940s. Many of our current day communities, especially the Yonsei, Gosei, the fourth, fifth generation, don't know about their ancestors' activism because much of these stories were kept silent for so many years. So this exhibit called Righting Wrongs, which is available on the Digital Museums Canada website, is live now, and it talks about the stories of the letter writers. There are some amazing videos. What we did was we researched all of the descendants of the letter writers and engaged with several of them to create beautiful videos of the descendants reading the stories of their ancestors. It's actually intended for high school education and undergraduate students primarily, but hopefully the resource will be interesting for everyone to learn more about this complex history.
I have to check that out soon.
I'll send you the link.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, Sherri, for joining me today. I think it has been very wonderful talking with you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you.